Hello BookTube, I'm Mike and this is Riff's Reading Renaissance. Gosh, I can't believe we're at the end of 2025. Where the heck did this year go? But indeed we are, and therefore in this time between Christmas and New Year, as we recover from our over festivities, and I do hope you had over festivities, I hope you had a wonderful time, but as we recover, we need to start looking at the year gone by. What did you read? What kind of a reading year was it? Did it meet your aspirations? Are you a planner? Are you a TBR person? I looked back. I'm not one who uses fancy Goodreads gadgets. I have a very simple app on my phone that records the books I read and the pages I've read, etc. And it was sufficient to give me some stats. So my stats are that in 2025, I read 16,000 pages, which is approximately 1,300 pages a month or 40 pages a day. And that totaled a sum total of 58 books in the year. Now, it's about one a week, just over one a week, which is not bad going. I think, again, if you compare to some of the stats we hear on BookTube, and even giving complete bona fides and accepting everybody at face value, it's a much slower read, and I've always known that. I keep saying to all of you who listen that I'm a slow reader, but I really am. One day I'd like to understand a little bit more about that. I think it may have something to do with the way my brain processes the intensity of what I'm reading, or it could just be that I'm not exercising the muscle enough. I don't know. But I also have a very busy job, as you know, and I'm thoroughly enjoying my December vacation time now, which is a different experience from the rest of my year. So in amongst all my other responsibilities as well, reading has to fight for its space. So 58 books for the year, I'm okay with that. It was a total blend of fiction, both classic and some very modern stuff, and non-fiction. I like reading politics, both world politics to see what's going on with the travails around the world, which are not getting any easier or less worrying, let's put it that way. And of course, locally in my own country, I want to know what's going on, and I like to read. There's a whole genre of political books published here by the local publishers who've realized that there's a lot of people in this country who like to read about what's going on to make sure they keep their finger on the pulse. And of course, biographies. I'm always a sucker for a good biography. And then finally, music is a category that I like just to read. I can always be tempted to read books about music because it's a massive passion. You will have seen some videos about some of the music books that I have particularly enjoyed this year. So I thought what I would do, and it's a bit of an experiment, I'm going to try and use one of these tier building gadgets. So we will see whether my reading renaissance has taken me far enough to conquer the technology, but let's give it a go, why don't we? As you can see from my thumbnail, I've tried to rank the books I've read, and I've ranked on a scale that starts, if I start from the bottom and we'll work our way up, the worst category is called Forests Died for This, which is my way of saying this book shouldn't have been printed. And obviously that's a very harsh category. The rest are a bit more understanding. Then on top of that, there's a category called Didn't Quite Meet the Hype. Moving up one, there's one called Worthy Effort, where you can see why this book is worthwhile, but maybe it didn't just move me enough. And then the next category is a good or fun read. It can either be a rattling good read or just a lot of fun. Either of those two criteria will get me to put it in that category. Then the next category up, which caters for a bit of the non-fiction stuff, is called Made Me Wiser, because sometimes you're just glad you read a book because of the learning or the understanding that it gave you of the world around. Then on top of that, the next category up is called Stone Cold Classic. This is a book where you sort of say, well, I know why this is a classic, it's fantastic, and it belongs in this category of Stone Cold Classic. And then the very top tier, which obviously is hard to reach, is called Best Read of the Year. And that's not a single category, but it's the books which qualify, in my mind, as the best that I've read this year. So if I walk you through my calendar, in January, I kicked off the year reading Erotic Vagrancy. Now, I've spoken a lot about Erotic Vagrancy. It's a biography of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. I've spoken so much about it that I'm not really inclined to spend a lot of time on it now, except to say that people like Stephen Fry and Marina Hyde have labeled it as the best thing they've ever read. I can't argue with that. I'm a big fan of Burton, a little bit less so of Taylor, but if you're interested in either one of these two, it's an immersive 600-page read. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it's an experience. And I'm putting that straight in as one of the best reads of the year because I really, really enjoyed it. Right after that, I took a complete change of pace and I tried reading a classic, The 39 Steps. The 39 Steps I'm putting in as a worthy effort. I enjoyed it. It didn't quite meet what I was hoping for, but I didn't feel it was harsh enough to be dropped into, didn't meet the hype. It's a worthy read, but it had a slightly dated feel, and the tension and adventure side of it felt a little bit dated, and maybe that's because it is, of course, dated. It was written a long time ago, but it was an enjoyable read, but nothing too much to get excited about. And then I drifted in January to a little bit of the non-fiction side, where I read two of Anne Applebaum's wonderful books. She's a very good historian who writes in a style that is accessible, and she wrote a book called The Twilight of Democracy, which explains some of the story of why the democracies around the world are failing. And that, of course, I would stick immediately into Made Me Wiser. And her follow-up book, which I also read, is called Autocracy, Inc. Now, Autocracy, Inc. is about how the autocracies around the world, the strongmen that are replacing democracies, are not doing so in isolation. Irrespective of whether they share any ideology whatsoever, they are part of a network of buddies who support each other. I won't now go deeper into the detail, otherwise we'll be here for hours. But that book is well worth investigating if you want to understand what the odds are against for those who are still rooting for democracy as a global governance system. There's big things at stake, and in Autocracy, Inc. is a sobering but very important read. And then, because I was on leave and running into the early days of February, I tackled one of the big mountains of literature. I tackled War and Peace. Now, War and Peace, of course, I'm going to put straight up into one of the best reads of the year. I could talk for hours about War and Peace. I'm not going to. It's well documented on BookTube and YouTube and everywhere else. Suffice to say, there's a reason it is the Himalaya of the literature world, and that the world is divided into those who've climbed that mountain and those who haven't. I'm just very glad I did. I could talk for ages about Tolstoy's brilliant writing, his ability to capture characterization in simple sentences, the fact that it is more like a lovable soap opera that just goes on and is very easy to read. It's got a false reputation of being difficult. It's just long. Anyway, enough said. It's sitting at the top in the best read of the category. That took me all of February. It took me a total of 45 days to read that book. I set myself a goal of at least 25 pages a day, and it got me through the book in 45 days. So that was a good strategy. And coming off that, I needed sort of a palate cleanser of some sort. I tried Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar, which I would class as a worthy effort. It's a story of her life in New York, and it's interesting. I enjoyed it. I didn't rave. I'm not sure I would be rushing out to recommend it to everybody, but I did enjoy it, and perhaps I enjoyed it more than some people who've pushed back a little bit on it. And in the same vein, I read The Great Gatsby. Now, The Great Gatsby, I think, has a lot of hype, and it's often held up as the great American novel. I'm on record on this channel already for saying that I actually prefer Tender is the Night. I think it's a better book than The Great Gatsby. But I enjoyed The Great Gatsby, and I've classed it as a worthy effort. I'm sure I'm going to cause some insult by not putting it in the Stone Cold Classic, but for me, I thought it was a worthy effort. Next up, I tried Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, and this I'm going to call a good or fun read. It's about a guy who is a small-time journalist for the local gardening magazine who gets mistaken for a wartime correspondent and never quite gets to put the record right, and the travails that happen. It's written in the way that only war can write, which is extremely funny and bitingly satirical about the English press media. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I put it in a good or fun read. The next book I read was again a non-fiction on the local politics side. It lumbers under the rather awkward name of Stay Woke, Go Broke. And it's written by Helen Ziller, who's a leader in the opposition party that's recently gone into the government of national unity. It's a book I thought, you see these books come out and you think, I need to read this so that I know what's going on. It was an interesting take. It's challenging the convention of the woke movement. I'm sort of in the middle. I think it's very important that we treat human beings as human beings, but I also think we need to run a society that doesn't require us to go to ridiculous lengths, which in fact end up unenabling society to operate. So I won't say more than that now. I know it's a very sensitive subject, but it was a worthwhile read. One thing I do like about Helen Ziller is she writes very fact-based books. She backs up what she's saying. You can disagree with her view. She's very polarizing here. People either love or hate her in the politics locally. But I thought it was a book that made me wiser, hence where I put it in the stack. The next up I followed, as we were watching, we're now in March, and as things were happening around the world and everybody's talking about the fact that it's a worrying time for political systems and for the worry of peace and harmony and threats of aggression. And I thought I needed to understand better the analogy that people were making between 1939, pre the Second World War, and the age we're in now in terms of democracy on the decline, authoritarianism rising, and possibly leading to fascism. So I read, and I'm going to stick it straight into Made Me Wiser, because of course it did, a book called Death of Democracy. And this is the story of how Hitler actually managed to move from a democratic system in Germany to becoming the Reichsführer in Germany, and how Germany's democratic system collapsed in the face of fascism. Very good read, very informative. I would recommend that to anybody. Coming off the back of that, at the end of March, I needed a bit of a relief from that rather sobering subject. So I read Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, which I'm going to put straight in as a stone cold classic. It's just a brilliant read. I really enjoyed this. If I just say without too much spoiling that you're dealing with an unreliable narrator, so if you like an unreliable narrator, this one might be for you. It's a thoroughly good book, and I fully understand why it is in the classics list. I would not hesitate to recommend it to anyone. Then we moved into April, and the first book I read in April was 84 Charing Cross Road, which of course won't surprise you, goes straight up to the top, because it is as good as everybody says it is. It's a very short book, but it's a moving book. It's a book written by people who love books for people who love books. So no great shock there that I included in one of my best reads. Then I was trying to tick off some Philip Roth. Now I'd read Portnoy's Complaint, which I think is a little bit of an isolated example perhaps, and therefore I tried another of Philip Roth's novels, which was The Plot Against America. Now again, I think Philip Roth, I think, is one of those that Steve says is waning. He's got this theory that authors sort of wax and wane. I quite liked it. It's an alternative history of America if things had not gone the way they had and history had been reversed. It's a good read, but it somehow didn't quite reach the hype that I'd been led to believe. So I've put it rather toughly, I think, into didn't quite meet the hype. That's where it's sitting. I know some people will be pleased and other people might say we told you, but this is all part of the reading experience and the Renaissance journey. Next, I dipped into James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. And this is, in my view, a stone cold classic. One doesn't have to think terribly hard about it. It's based on his childhood, basically, which is complicated with a lot of brutality, a lot of poverty, a lot of religious surrounds and culture, not all of which positive, very regimented, and some cases of people with religious titles and religious offices not acting in very moral ways, let's put it that way. But it's Baldwin, and Baldwin always writes beautifully. And I'm glad I read it. I can see exactly why it's a classic, and rightfully so. I would recommend it to anybody. Then we dipped back into non-fiction for a book called Mission to South Africa. Now, this is written by Robert Renwick, who is the retired ambassador of Britain to South Africa. And he was here as ambassador during the period of transition from the old apartheid regime through the new free democratic elections that saw Nelson Mandela become president. So that was a very interesting time to be a British ambassador, and he's written a memoir about his experience of that. Perhaps a little bit local. I'm not sure if people outside the country would necessarily be as interested in it as I was, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I put that there under Made Me Wiser, as most of these non-fiction books will end up in the Made Me Wiser category, but it certainly did, and it's very well written. It's nicely written, and I'm intrigued because he's also written a biography of Helen Suzman, who, if you don't know, Helen Suzman was the sole Jewish white lady who was in the whites-only parliament representing the Progressive Party, standing against the apartheid government of the time. In those days, only white people were allowed in the parliament, and Helen Suzman was a feisty politician who took every opportunity in a very difficult circumstance to fight for the rights of all South Africans. And Renwick knew her well, and he has written a biography of hers, which I've got. I need to find the time to get around to reading that, but that's a story for next year, perhaps. And then I realmed a bit into strange territory. I read a biography by a local South African author called Karen Cronje, who is one of the many people who goes internationally to teach English in foreign climes. And she wrote a book about her experience of visiting Korea and teaching English in Korea while still trying to manage a life back in South Africa remotely. And it's quite an intriguing book. So I enjoyed it, and I've stuck it under worthy effort. It was fun. It wasn't a life-changing read, but I'm glad she wrote it because I enjoyed reading about it. And I think anyone who's lived the expat life or has tried to bring English teaching to foreign climes will find something in it to relate to in a sense. Then it was time for another classic. I chose Moll Flanders. Now here, I'm going to start by putting Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe into the didn't quite meet the hype. And you'll need to tell me whether I'm being fair or unfair, because I have to admit, this book I tried to listen to as opposed to read on audiobook. And at the end of the book, I didn't like it. I didn't find it very interesting. I found it dragged on. I had a lot about it that generally left me feeling, I'm not enjoying this. And I don't know whether that's because it was an audiobook or whether in fact it's just something one should take up with Mr. Defoe, because I have heard other people. I know the immortal Jack Edwards hates Daniel Defoe, and I'm not saying that makes Jack Edwards right, but I'm intrigued. I need to perhaps think about giving him a second chance, because I am worried about the audiobook thing. I'm not really, I do believe, no shade for those who like audiobooks, but I don't think audiobook listening is the same thing as reading the printed word. I think they are very different activities, both equally valid, but just different. And I think the audiobook thing just didn't work for me. Maybe there were too many distractions, because of course audiobooks you do while driving or while doing something else. I don't know whether that's the problem. Anyway, sorry, but that's where it ended up. Didn't quite do it for me. Anyway. Next up was a rather strange book, which this is a bit of a sort of for fans only. This channel will know my love of Jethro Tull, the rock band. And then one of their fans wrote a book called Life is a Long Song, which is the title comes from a title of a Jethro Tull song. Now, this is a book basically written by a fan about his love of the band. So I think it's only going to be a fun read, which is what I called it, for fans of the band. And I am one, so I enjoyed it. I didn't learn a lot from it, but then I'm a bit of a anorak expert on Jethro Tull, having been obsessive about them for nearly 50 years, as I said in a video the other day. But it certainly, I had a lot of fun reading it. So there it is. And then I tried a book. Now, I read Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country some time back, and everybody knows it. It's one of the most famous books in the South African literature canon. But his second novel, called Too Late the Phalarope, is almost never mentioned. And I was curious, and I found it in a thrift shop, and therefore I gave it a read. And I tell you what, I ended up enjoying it and thinking it is a better book than Cry the Beloved Country, which I know is a big claim to make. But it was, look, I don't know whether this is because I'm a South African, whether I'm reading it through the lens of someone who's lived through the experiences he's talking about. But my goodness, the quick story, I mustn't spend too long on it, but this is about a policeman. You can see him on the cover there. The policeman who's in charge of regulating the Immorality Act, which says there cannot be sexual relations across the color bar, the racial divide, until he falls for a black girl. And then what happens? It's just brilliantly written. The suspense about who knows what and who's going to say what. It really was one of the reading experiences of my year. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I'm curious to know whether it would have the same impact for non-South Africans. But boy, it just floored me. There were moments where I literally gasped as I was reading, which doesn't happen very often. Anyway. After that, I went back to the sort of mainstream classics, and I read Madame Bovary, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm sure Madame Bovary is relatively well known. I'm going to put it in the Stone Cold Classic category because, in fact, it is, of course, a Stone Cold Classic. I found it very interesting, having a self-centered character in Madame Bovary. Flaubert writes with beautiful language, and of course I know I'm at the mercy of a translator from the French, but boy, the translator in this case, whose name I don't have here, I might add it in, did a splendid job because the language just flows like water. It was a pleasant reading experience and fully worthy of the Stone Cold Classic slot. Then next up, we've now we're into June, and I read Stoner by John Williams. Now, this is a book that is quite divisive because people either love it or dismiss it as a dude bro book. And if you see where I'm going to put it, right up there as one of my best reads of the year, then you know I'm taking a stand, and you know where that puts me. I just think the writing is brilliant. It's about an introverted literature professor, and it tells the story of his life very simply, but in language that is just so flowing. I don't know whether I related to it as a bookish person. I just absolutely loved it. So there it is at the top. Then, reaching further outside the comfort zone, I read a book called My Dark Vanessa. Now, this is a book that tackles the Lolita issue, but from the other side. The book is written in the voice of Vanessa, who's the young student who falls for the English lecturer who's much older than her, and who does not see herself as a victim in this whole sensitive Me Too environment. It's a very nuanced and I think well-written book, obviously getting into a territory that's deeply uncomfortable and deeply difficult. I've ended up putting it as a worthy effort. I don't feel qualified necessarily to talk too much on that particular subject, but I thought it was a worthwhile read on a difficult subject, and I was glad I had read it. Next up, we went back to the ancients for Lysistrata by Aristophanes. And this, I can tell you, I'm going to stick straight into a fun read. because it's short, it's easy. If you haven't read it, it's about Lysistrata is a woman in the ancient Greek community who is sick of the men warring and constantly being unavailable because of the war. And the women decide to go on a sex strike. They withhold sexual favors from their men in order to force them to come to terms and sign a peace treaty. And it's girl power all the way. It's just a wonderful book, and it's a particularly joyful experience to realize how little has changed in human nature. It may have been written so many years ago, but boy, the issues are exactly the same as the issues we grapple with today. So a real fun read, and I would highly recommend it to anybody. Next up was Frankenstein, which has been on my TBR forever. I'm going to be a bit tough. I'm going to put Frankenstein on the one that says didn't quite meet the hype, because to be honest, it was good. And I mean, when you think Mary Shelley was so young when she wrote it, it's very impressive. But maybe it's one of those things where you've just heard too much about it for too long, and it's a little unfair. Maybe the hype it's reached a level that was unfair. I enjoyed it. I didn't think it was, a life-changing experience. Then, while we're still in the ancients, I read the ancient tale of Gilgamesh, because you need to have read Gilgamesh, and I'm very glad I did. I ended up putting Gilgamesh into the Made Me Wiser category, which is unusual for a book of fiction. I'm not sure I really loved it. I'm glad I read it, because it was part of an experience of experiencing one of the oldest books that there is, if not the oldest book that we know about. Obviously, only some extracts from it. It was a good read. It wasn't a deeply moving read for me, which may say more about me than about Gilgamesh. But anyway, I decided I was wiser for having read it, and therefore that's where I put it. Then we got to July, and it was time to bring out the big guns. Moby-Dick had been on my reading list forever, and if you followed my channel, I started my first newbie tag video in the 1st of July, followed immediately by a review of Moby-Dick, because I had finished Moby-Dick in July and wanted everybody to know that. Now, I mean, not a great surprise. I'm going to put Moby-Dick up the top as one of the best reads. It was an experience. There's a video. I've done a video. You can see it. Wherever I spoke point, you can see it, so I won't talk about it now. But it is one of those books, like War and Peace, that you need to plan to read and get read. There's bits of it that are not easy to read, but there are bits of it that are revelatory in terms of what can be done with language, and it's very clear why it has become the quintessential foundational American novel. So, having conquered Moby-Dick, as you can see from my video, I decided to go local again, and I pulled out a book from our local political sphere called Being There by Tony Leon. Now, Being There, I will immediately put it into the Made Me Wiser column, because most of the political reads locally are not about fun literary experiences. They're actually about knowing what's really going on. But I will give credit to Tony Leon here. Tony Leon is a predecessor to the Helen Ziller I mentioned earlier. He was the head of the largest opposition party in the new South Africa, standing against the ANC in what's currently called the Democratic Party. But what makes this interesting is that, as you probably know, South Africa has for the first time not had a clear majority winner in its elections, and now we're into coalition politics as a new experience for the fledgling democratically free South Africa. And Tony Leon, who'd retired, was brought back by the Democratic Party as an expert consultant in the Government of National Unity negotiations. So it's all a little bit technical if you're not a local South African, but if you are, the secret to Tony Leon's book is that he's not just a politician who's very clever and very experienced, he's a damn good writer, and therefore it's an extremely readable book about a subject that I really wanted to know something about. So there you go. Then we were approaching the Garb August period. In August, we were supposed to read garbage, and I was new. I was the new kid on the block, so I was trying anything. And I struggled to read garbage. You'll find that the books I've actually read are things disguised as garbage, but they're not really garbage. And the first of those was a Canadian novel by Marion Engel called Bear, which has won many, many awards in Canada. It's a very strange novel about a lonely librarian who gets sent to a far-off castle where there's a library to be catalogued, and there's also a bear, and she starts a relationship with this bear, and the book covers the very odd relationship that she has with the bear. But the writing, both about the loneliness and the natural surroundings in Canada, it's just, the writing is brilliant. So to me, I put it under a good read. I'm not saying it's a classic necessarily. It may go on to be classic. It's a bit left of center for most people, the relationship between a lonely librarian and a bear, as you can see from that cover. But it was, I thought, a really, really good read. So that's where I put it. Then, continuing with Garb August, my next attempt to find a good book disguised as garbage was Ian McEwan's book, The Cockroach. I've talked a lot about this before. He wrote it as a protest against Brexit, the decision by the British government to exit from the European Union, which he violently opposed. It's a parody on Kafka's Metamorphosis, where, of course, as you know, a man wakes up and finds he's a bug. In McEwan's Cockroach, a whole lot of cockroaches wake up and find that they're British politicians. So that's the zaniness. But McEwan's writing and the biting satire is just brilliant beyond words, and it really was, despite the rather strange premise of the book, it was one of the best reading experiences I had this year. So I popped it up the top. Then, really trying hard to find garbage, I found a book called White Trash, and that sounded about right. It's the story of a local girl who, Terry Angelos, I think her name is, who left South Africa for the bright lights of London, made mistakes. It's a story of disaster and then eventually redemption. And I think it's what I would call a worthy effort. It was interesting to read, but not life-changing for me, to be very honest. Then the next one, still in Garb August and still under pressure to find trashy books, I found a book called Lolito, and that immediately intrigued me, because the ending of O can often be the gender opposite of the ending in A. So to take Lolita and turn it into Lolito suggested, as the book in fact does, that it's a young boy we're talking about here and an older woman. It's a very modern book. It's written quite recently, and it's an intriguing book, but it's very, very well written in a modern British context. So I stuck it under good or fun read. I'll let you decide whether I thought it was good or fun, because of course the Lolita theme is not without its challenges. But I thought it was very well written, and as I was finding my way through the mazes of Garb August, I was quite glad I chose it. Another one I chose in that month was called Unprecedented. Now, this is a local parody of one of the presidents that has gone before in this country and was not particularly loved by everybody, let's just say. It's probably more fun for people locally who know the context, but it was brilliantly written, and some of the biting satire, again, just made me laugh. So I stuck it under a fun read. This one I thought was a fun read. Then there was a cat theme, and I ended up reading a rather strange book about prides of lions and what you could learn from them to apply in the world of business. And I thought perhaps the metaphor was a little bit stretched in terms of, come on guys, we're all stronger as a team, and the sum of the parts and all that stuff. So I ended up putting that in, not quite meeting the hype, but it was harmless. And then, still on the cat theme, I read a book perhaps aimed at young adults called The Cat Chronicles, where the cat has 9 lives, literally, but each of the 9 lives is lived through history in a different period. And this was thoroughly charming. I really would recommend this to any young reader. It's a beautifully illustrated book, and I thought it was a very worthy effort, and consequently, that's where it ended up. And then you're sitting saying, why did I create a category called Forests Died for this if there's no books going in that category. But wait. For Garb August, the group read was James Patterson's Zoo. And I have to tell you, I think this is one of the worst books I've ever read. It had as much wrong with it as I can imagine. But if you really want to think about why I don't like it, go check out my Garb August video, which I'll link above, and you'll see. But that one, I'm afraid, is to me just a waste of time, ink, pulp, paper, and forests. I didn't enjoy that at all. I do think Mr. Patterson is a bit of a cynic and seems to be a bit like Trump, where his name appears on everything, but it doesn't really mean he's actually very much part of the project at all. But moving swiftly on, lest I offend anybody who enjoys him, because reading is, of course, a very personalized taste. Again, desperately looking for garbage or disguised books as garbage, I found Spike Milligan's satire of Lady Chatterley's Lover, which I included in my Garb August reading list. And I have to say, it is what it says on the tin. It was just a good, fun read. If you like Spike Milligan's humor, I won't talk about it now because we could spend a day talking about it. But it's very zany, very off the wall. And how he retells that story is just hysterical. It's absolutely funny. Particularly if you've read Lady Chatterley, you will enjoy it even more. And still scratching, August felt like a long month, but perhaps it was because I was reading short books. Still scratching for rubbish, garbage. I found a book called At Bonus Time, No One Can Hear You Scream, which is one of these corporate novels about how brutal the workplace is. Yeah, I'm going to put this under hype. It wasn't rubbish. It wasn't as bad as Zoo, but it really, yeah. It didn't move me very much. And as I've said before, I'm still trying to work out what my relationship with Garb August will be going forward. It feels like we've dated a few times, but not really sure we're feeling the magic there. But anyway, everything changed when we got to September, because September had two events in BookTube. The first was Framed in September, where we had to go all artsy and reach outside the boundaries and do art-related reading. And for that, I picked this book called The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. And I have to say, this was a revelation. It was absolutely beautiful. It was written in a prose that I didn't know Tracy Chevalier's writing at all. She writes historical fiction, but I had not experienced it before. And it goes straight to the top of the list as one of the best reading experiences I had this year. I just completely fell in love with her central character, who is the protagonist that ends up in the painting as the girl with the pearl earring. And the way she captured the personality of the artist really appealed to me, because I have a little bit of artist in me as a performer and one who's very fond of the arts. And the makeup of the artistic personality was so brilliantly captured in this book. And I just, everything about it. I lived in Holland, and when I read this book, which was set in Delft back in the time of Vermeer, it's just, on every level, this was a joyous reading experience. So it goes right to the top immediately. Then I tried The Old Man and the Sea as one of the books that I felt needed to be tackled. Some people have said it's a poor man's Moby-Dick, and perhaps that's why it doesn't live up to the hype. It was okay. I didn't not enjoy it, and I'm glad I read it, but it didn't sort of move me on anything like the level of Moby-Dick. So it ended up a little bit underhyped, or under its own hyped. But to compensate for that, as we headed into September, I read The Quiet American by Graham Greene, which I'm going to call a stone cold classic. It's a really good read. I'm not going to tell you much about it because it's mainly spoilers, but it's set in Vietnam just before the Vietnam War. And there's this sort of tension in the air and people doing things undercover and that kind of espionage. Really, really, really good. Highly recommend it. And it's made me want to read a lot more Graham Greene. And then I read Edith Wharton's short story, The Reckoning, which I liked. It was a very short story, so it was difficult to sort of say that it blew me away or anything like that. Wharton's writing is always good, but I didn't think the short story was necessarily her best format, so I've stuck it under worthy effort anyway. Then again, from left field, in a thrift shop, I found the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and I realized I had never read it and I had never thought of reading it. So I bought it and I read it, very cheap, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's verse, and it's much more playful verse and bawdy verse than I had ever realized. It's basically summing up saying, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That would be the one sentence summary of it. Whereas I had thought it was something much more lofty and much more holier than thou than that. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would encourage everybody. The edition I had here is beautifully illustrated. I believe it might be the originals, I don't know, but it's definitely worth a read. It was a fun read, and that was a revelation to me. I was not expecting that. Still in September, the other big theme we had for September was, of course, Shakespeare, where we go all gaga-eyed about Shakespeare. And this was something I thoroughly enjoyed. I read non-fiction. I read Bill Bryson's book on Shakespeare. It's simply called Shakespeare. And I thoroughly enjoyed that, and indeed it made me wiser. We don't know a lot about Shakespeare in terms of historical fact detail, and I thought Bill Bryson's book was very readable and very interesting in making me a little bit wiser about Shakespeare, and it's encouraged me to go on and read other Shakespeare novels. Next up was, still with Shakespeare, I read Anthony Burgess's Nothing Like the Sun. Now, this book you've heard me probably talk about if you listen to my channel. It's the story of Shakespeare's life. Nothing Like the Sun is a reference to one of his sonnets, and in that sonnet he's writing to what's called the Dark Lady. And this is a slightly fictionalized version of his life in which Burgess assumes that he knows what happened. But the brilliance of this book is it's written in Shakespearean style, and that doesn't mean it's hard to read. It just, you feel like you're reading something that Shakespeare might have written, and it is so brilliant that I'm putting it straight up to one of my best reads of the year, and it's turned me into a little bit of a Burgess fan. I'm now tracking down in all the thrift shops and checking if you've got any copies of the many books he's written. I'm sure they can't all be great, they can't all be as good as this, but this was spectacularly good. And I wanted to stick it at the top for that reason. Next, things got even better, because my next pick was Vanity Fair by Thackeray. And I'll reference you here to the video I did on it, so I'm not going to spend time telling you again, but it was undoubtedly a revelation, a fantastic book, and clearly one of the best reading experiences I had this year. Next, in a non-fiction sense, as I've chatted a bit about, I'm trying to build towards a project about South African literature. I read a non-fiction book, which is the biography of a South African censor during the days of apartheid. That's an interesting left field thing. I'll stick it under the Made Me Wiser, because it was interesting and I learned a lot. I'm not sure I completely buy all his arguments about how hard he was trying to make everything better, but that wasn't the point. It was a fact-finding mission, and it ticked the box for me about getting me closer to some of the interesting stories. For example, it is true that the book Black Beauty by Anna Sewell was in fact banned because the censors, who clearly didn't bother to read the book and realize it was about a horse, felt that the concept of Black Beauty as a title was a threat to the apartheid regime. So go figure. And the next book I read, because Mark from Book Time with Elvis cited it constantly as his favorite book, was Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. And indeed, he's not wrong. It was a great fun read, a nice short book, easy to knock off, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Getting serious again, as the politics didn't get any easier on the global stage, I read George Orwell's short book on fascism and democracy, which again I'm going to stick in the Made Me Wiser column, because that's what it did. It wasn't designed as a fun read, and even though he wrote it way back in the 1940s, if I have it right, it was extremely prescient, and all the issues he was flagging are as real today as they've ever been. Then we had got to November, and of course November is the spy reading espionage month, where you, under the auspices of Dr. November. And again, I've talked endlessly because I was a co-host with Mark and others, and you can see a lot of those videos already if you like. But suffice it to say that The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was a splendid read, a good read. I also read Diamonds Are Forever, which was also my first James Bond and Ian Fleming novel, as Spy Who Came In From the Cold was my first Le Carre novel. So again, the trouble is I keep finding these brilliant authors and wanting to get pushed off down a side path to go and read their other novels, but one needs to manage the TBR somehow. And again, in the non-fiction space, I also read Frederick Forsyth's autobiography called The Outsider, which I've talked about as well. And in a word, it was brilliant. He's lived an adventurous life, and most of the novels that I enjoyed reading as a kid, I now see are based very much on experiences that he actually had. So that was a fun read indeed. And the last book I read during Dr. November was I Lie for a Living, which is issued by one of the spy museums in America. And it's basically little vignettes about spies from ancient to modern. It was extremely interesting and a nice little bite-sized chunk book where you could dip in and out. And that I'm going to put under Made Me Wiser, because I learned a lot. Then closing out the year in December, I went back and looked at a video I did earlier about books that had been on my shelf too long and hadn't been read, and I tried to tackle a couple of those before the year was out. One of them is Fahrenheit 451, which, needless to say, is a stone cold classic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's a book every book lover should read, because it's about a society in which owning and reading books is not allowed. So you need to understand how much worse that could be than the way we live now. And on a similar dystopian theme, I then read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which I'm also going to put in as a stone cold classic. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I enjoyed this a little bit more than I thought I would, because again, it's been hyped a bit and I thought maybe I won't like it. But I really, really enjoyed the way it was written and the way it made one think about which of these changes in future societies was necessarily good or bad, and why. And sometimes when cures don't achieve what they are meant to achieve, do you leave people, it's a little bit like Burgess's Clockwork Orange, do you leave people with the ability to do wrong, or do you take away their ability to do wrong? That kind of debate. But a thoroughly well-written book, and timely as ever, as we look around us now and people are challenging some of the freedoms we were taking for granted very recently. And then, in honor of Randy Ray, who recommended this book, I went back and I thought, let me read Carmilla before I read Dracula, because I haven't read Dracula yet. I've knocked off Frankenstein now and Carmilla, so Dracula must be up next. But Carmilla I enjoyed. I put it under worthy effort. I found it a little bit predictable. I always felt I knew where the story was going, and it did go there. But it was very nicely written, and it is intriguing that it takes the vampire concept and gives it a slightly LGBT twist, if you like. Okay, so those are the books I read. And now, if I've established who's in the best reads of the year, it's time to actually give out the awards. I'm only going to give one award for best biography and one award for best history, and then I'm going to do the top 10 ranked of the fiction that I read. So, no great secret, with an honorable mention to Frederick Forsyth for his biography, which I really enjoyed. Erotic Vagrancy, the Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor biography, is simply in a class of its own. So that's my choice for biography of the year in terms of what I read. And history book of the year is Death of Democracy by Benjamin Carter Het, which is Hitler's rise to power and the downfall of the Weimar Republic, which is sobering in its comparisons to what's going on around us today. Okay, and then we sit with, so if I move Erotic Vagrancy to the end of the queue, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 books. Now, I'm going to therefore allow myself to pick one of the Stone Cold Classics to move up into my fiction. And my choice is going to be The Quiet American. So The Quiet American is my number 10 choice of fiction book read this year. Really, really, really brilliant read. Number 9 goes to The Girl with the Pearl Earring. I spoke earlier about quite how wonderful this book is, and I would encourage you to give it a go because it's something very different. It's a little bit unexpected discovery. Number 8, again, outside the comfort zone, but what a fantastic read. Ian McEwan's biting satire on Brexit called The Cockroach. That's my choice for number 8. Number 7, some would say it probably should be higher, but for me, this was number 7, Moby-Dick. So I'll put him there in number 7th place. I've talked a lot about him already, so I won't do any more. And number 6 is 84 Charing Cross Road. Simply wonderful. Anyone who's read it will tell you. There's 84 Charing Cross Road. We move into 6th position. Number 5 is John Williams's Stoner, which I thoroughly enjoyed, as I said. That's my number 5 pick. And coming in at number 4, the fantastic Anthony Burgess Shakespeare novel, Nothing Like the Sun. There's the Dark Lady with Shakespeare, as we said earlier. Nothing Like the Sun comes in for me at number 4. Number 3 is the South African novel by Alan Paton, his second novel that doesn't get as much love as Cry the Beloved Country, Too Late, The Phalarope. This is a spectacular read. So that's coming in at number 3. And I'm not going to move the other 2 around because coming in at number 2, a simply fantastic and greatly surprising read. I had no idea I was going to enjoy this quite as much as I did. Vanity Fair. I would recommend it heartily. The beauty of a book that has no good heroes in it at all. It was simply wonderful from start to finish. But of course, spoiler alert, if you read War and Peace, it pretty much has to be your number 1 reading experience of the year because it's simply that magnificent. I could talk for days, and I'm sure lots of people have, so I probably won't bore you. I would only say that if you have not read Tolstoy, start with Anna Karenina. It's a good stepping stone, but don't go to your grave without having read this book. It is an experience. There's a reason why the Russians are so good at literature. They have an ability to capture the human condition and turn it in a phrase. And as I said earlier, it's not as hard to read as people think. It's just a lot of it. But we all sit and watch soap operas that go on and on and on for months and months and months and are quite easy to digest. So, having said that, that's my reading choices for the year, ranked from top 10 of fiction. And the winner, of course, is War and Peace. So, but I think the real winner is me. I mean, I have had a fantastic half year. I started BookTube in the 1st of July, and it has simply been a roller coaster of wonderful experiences. So as we close out the year, thank you so much for this coming on this journey with me as I discover new books and old books and wonderful books and some books that don't quite come up to the hype, but hey, that's the rub. I'm an eclectic reader. I'm a bit of a mood reader, and something will reach out and suddenly say, I think I should be next. But all in all, it's been a good year of reading. I've had some learnings. As I said, I need to get my head around what Garb August is for me and whether I could spend my time maybe better than I did this year in terms of choosing books in that month. But the rest of the year I'm happy with. I'll do another video shortly about what happens next year. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I wish you the very best for 2026. I hope you will have a quiet finish to 2025, nice, peaceful, quiet time to do some quality reading. Can I just say, I'm really grateful to all of you for the support. Thank you for watching this video, And if you've enjoyed watching the journey with me, please think about liking and subscribing. It really does make a difference. And in any event, I hope I'll see you again soon. So thank you very much, and bye-bye now.